and the use of ESCOs to enable the implementation of energy efficiency projects. I've been in that business for 25 years. I started out my career as an ESCO employee in Canada, and since the last 20 years have been involved in over 40 countries in developing this kind of projects and approaches in different environments. So hopefully by today I'm going to be able to share with you a bit of my experience and help you understand the different possibilities and limitations of that concept. Basically, we'll talk about two subjects which are directly linked. Energy performance contracting, which is the actual concept that is going to be promoted, and energy service companies, which are the type of organizations that implement energy performance contracting. So we'll basically go through 6 different modules today, talking about the concept of energy efficiency benefits and barriers, very briefly, presenting the EPC concept. So when I refer to EPC, it's always referring to energy performance contracting. We'll talk about the different contractual approaches, the different financing structures, measurement and verifications of savings, which is a fundamental concept that has to be used in EPC. And then we'll go through different models and examples. On top of that, we will talk about public procurement, and we will talk about different subjects related to the use of performance contracting. So let's start with the energy efficiency projects, their benefits and the barriers. And that's something that I guess most of you know already. Energy efficiency has essentially positive aspects to it. For the end user, the people who pays the energy cost, implementing an energy efficiency project will help lower their operational costs by the fact that we will implement better equipment, newer equipment, more efficient equipment. The equipment will be often operated in a more efficient way. There will be new equipment installed, so likely they will need less maintenance. And the value of the building or the industry is going to be increased by the presence of these new and modern equipment. Because everything is going to work better and the downtime is going to be lower, then we would have an improved quality within the equipment, in the facility itself. For the industries, they're going to be more competitive. Very often, because we will optimize the different mechanical and electrical systems, we will have a higher comfort levels in the building. And at least, the beneficiary will have a greener image, which is always good for governments, industries, buildings when they want to rent their facilities. So basically, there's a lot of benefits. There's not a lot of negative element about installing an energy efficiency project. In the past, there's been some questions about air quality because there was that link about energy efficiency, basically shutting down equipment to save energy. But the experience has shown that's probably the other way around. That's when equipment are optimized, then the air quality is increased and not decreased. But otherwise, energy efficiency brings a lot of benefits, and they obviously contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. So globally, for both the end user and for the global community, would it be the government, would it be the community surrounding an industry, or more globally within the different countries which are concerned about climate change. Energy efficiency has been seen as one of the most positive ways that we can address all these problems. And on top of it, it's commercially viable. So it's not a measure that you have to implement and it costs something to benefit the environment. The end user directly benefits from it. So if energy efficiency projects are so good and they have a lot of benefits for everyone, why are they not implemented? But there's a lot of what we call the barriers. And the common barriers are listed here on that slide. The first one is awareness. Well, very often, people don't implement these type of projects because they don't know they exist in their own facility. So it can go at something as simple as replacing the type of lamps you're using to something very, very sophisticated about production processes. So if people knew, they might be interested, but a lot of the time they just don't know these opportunities. Then we talk about knowledge. You may be aware that you have to do something, but you may not have the capacity to implement it. So you don't have the engineering capacity, you don't understand the impact of such technologies in your facility, you may have wrong impressions about the real benefits on the technical basis of these equipment. Lack of capacity will be that you may have that knowledge, but you may not just have the technical capacity to implement those projects. And you're probably all aware that when you go into a facility and you propose them an additional project, there's rarely someone waiting, doing nothing, and very, very happy to take in charge such a project. So when I talk about lack of capacity, it's not necessarily lack of capacity in terms of technical knowledge, but sometimes it's just the matter that they don't have the time, they don't have the organization in place to be able to deal with such projects. So even though they're aware and even though they know such projects could be good for them, they just don't do it. Then there's a lack of confidence in project's results. You may know or think that the project may have a 3 or 4 year payback project, but you may not totally trust that those savings will appear. So what happens if you're looking for a 20% return on investment on a project, and it happens that at the end of that project it's going to be 10% or 5%. So there's a lot of trust in these projects because very often in these facilities, the decision makers are not very knowledgeable about these type of projects, and they're a lot more confident about other type of investment they can make. Last but not least, financing. A very important barrier when you go into facilities and you present them projects is that they say, we understand that it would be a very, very good project for us, but we just don't have the money to do it, or we don't want to commit our financial resources through loans that we have our credit margins to implement those projects. So at the end of the day, what we find out in the energy efficiency market is that there's tremendous opportunities out there, technically simple, not a lot of financial risk involved, excellent payback and return on investment, and these projects are not implemented. So that's why we talk about barriers. So now comes energy performance contracting. Well, if there was no barriers and the market was not deficient, technically there would be no energy performance contracting approaches. EPC is basically there to address those barriers, to help implement those projects and addressing the barriers so there is an actual benefit from the end user. So I'll try not to read throughout the presentation, but some definitions are interested to read at some point. So basically an energy performance contract is a contractual arrangement between a beneficiary and a provider, the provider being called an ESCO, for the implementation of an energy efficiency project where the global investments have to be paid for through a contractually agreed level of energy cost reduction. So basically, as you read that presentation, it doesn't mean that the ESCO have to finance the project. And we see that through the different slides. But the main concept for a project or contract to be recognized as an EPC is that the ESCO remuneration has to be linked somehow with the performance of the project. So that's really the definition. So an ESCO is basically the firm that implements projects through the use of an energy performance contracting approach. And then we say here, whose payments are directly linked with the project performance. So we'll see with the different contractual approaches, what does that mean? So through a graph, through a picture, you see basically what the EPC approach is. The normal way to implement a project is basically to have a client, a beneficiary, define, understand, implement, finance, and benefit from the project. Such a client will have to work through many different partners. So very often a consulting firm, a contracting firm to implement, will have to buy equipment, will have to go see government if there are subsidies involved, the financial institutions to finance the project. You have to link with the utilities to address the new cost structure that could be used within the facility. So there's a lot of people involved. And if the project does not succeed or does not generate the expected savings, well, all the risk is on the side of the client. So you can go back to each of these partners and basically say, well, I'm not achieving my savings, and one will say that's the fault of the other. When you work with an ESCO, you want a one-stop shop. You basically ask the ESCO to implement a project in your facility and to guarantee somehow the savings that are going to be generated. Then after that, anytime that there would be any kind of a problem, would it be on the technical side or on the financial side, you only talk to one person. One of the things that is important is that ESCO sell savings. And there's a mental shift that has to be done by the client. When he used to buy equipment, he used to be in control of the project implemented. Now, under certain limitation, the ESCO is going to be in charge, meaning that they're selling savings and they're not selling equipment. So they will be the one to decide what to be changed, how to change it, how to operate it, how to maintain it, because at the end, their final deliverables is savings. So that means that an ESCO has to have a lot of skills. So we see that he has to be able to sell the concept and sell the projects. He needs to have a very good technical capacity, and we'll see all these different terms within the presentation, but an IGA is essentially an audit. He will be able to do engineering, measurement and verification. We'll talk about it. He will be in charge of construction, project management, financing, because the contract is a little bit more complicated than typical contract. Then he has to be very good at the development of such contracts, taking care of local regulations. He will have to be able to work under a risk management plan because he's taking more risk than just the installation of an equipment. He will have to be able to have good knowledge about operation and maintenance. Either he might do it by himself, or he can basically advise people how to do that. And you will have to offer training and management support to the end user, to the client. It does not mean that the ESCO has to have all that internally. It can subcontract part of that, but at the end of the day, it's responsible for all that. Some of these elements might be subcontracted. For example, an audit, the construction, the development of a contract, but still, as the ESCO is responsible for everything, he has to have a very deep knowledge of all these elements. Some ESCOs are very small and they subcontract everything, or most of it. Other ESCOs are totally integrated, So all of this can be found within the ESCO or in the ESCO owners group. On the process of selling such a project, you basically start with a preliminary survey. The ESCO will want to know if there is a possibility to implement such a project where we will take a lot more risk than technically just answering a request from a client. As example, I would like to buy a chiller, so I know my client wants a chiller, so I'll prepare a proposal. In our case, the client wants to have savings. Sometimes his needs are defined. Most of the time they're not. So the preliminary survey will basically serve the ESCO to make sure that there is such a project. Then we have the verification of energy savings methodology, procurement process, customer spending categories, and all that, to basically define that even though there's a project that the ESCO sees, we have to make sure that we agree with the client on the different terms that would be acceptable for them to implement such a project. So do they want the payback of the project to be within 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? Do they have limitations on subsections of their facility that they don't want to be affected by the project? And so on. So they have to be a very good understanding by the ESCO of what is of interest to the client in such a project. Even though if there's a request for proposal, if it's a public tender, this will have to be defined in the tender. If it's a private sector approach, then you have to define it with the client. You have a preliminary proposal that explains pretty much how everything is going to be implemented. You agree on the terms of a project where the ESCO will take the responsibility to develop, organize the financing, implement, and guarantee in some ways the savings. And they will basically make sure that the client understands all the approach proposed by the ESCO. After that stage, there's the habit of signing a letter of interest or a letter of intent. Basically, we want the client to agree that what we're proposing makes sense. And as you see in that section so far, we're not quite a lot focused on the technical side of the project. So what has to be agreed is more the concept of the ESCO implementing a project under a certain very specific approach, the length of the contract, the obligation of the ESCOs and of the end user, and at the end the benefit of that project, which is generating savings to pay back the investment and to make sure that the client has some kind of benefit, either short-term or medium-term. The next step starts to be more technical. So we conduct a detailed engineering study, which is called an investment audit. This audit is basically to define the project in the details, the level of details that's going to be needed by the ESCO to implement the project after that. It's also needed to make sure that on the customer side, he will know exactly what is proposed. He will know exactly how it's going to be done. And he may object at some point for whatever reason if he feels that a proposal will not be fitting his interest. As much as possible, we try to avoid that case and try to know from the client what would not be acceptable before. But often the devil's in the details. So sometimes it's at that level that the client may request some readjustments to the project. When that is done, there's a risk review by the ESCO, basically to make sure that the project as designed, the cost of the project and the savings that are going to be generated, they're sure enough so the ESCO can start getting involved in such a project. We then enter into a full energy service agreement, which means that we agree based on the audit of the exact project to be implemented. After that, it's basically a construction approach. we install, and then we'll talk about measurement and verification in the next few slides. I presented those two slides because the concept of preparing, developing, and signing a contract with a client is very often where ESCO fails. They don't understand very well the process. And sometimes ESCO takes a lot more risk than it would be acceptable, and then they basically fail at some point because the project fails, not necessarily completely, but it does not necessarily generate the expected savings. There might be technical problems, but most of the time project fails because the global project is not well understood by the different parties. The client expects something, the ESCO expects something, and it's not the same thing. So when you try to sell the project, people don't agree on what it is, or they spend a lot too much time to try to develop that project and get the contract to sign it. And then the transaction cost to get to that point becomes so high that it's uninteresting for the ESCO. Let's talk about contractual approaches. Basically, within the industry, there's 3 different ways that energy performance contracting can be implemented. In most new countries where the concept is started, they very often understand the concept only by one of these mechanisms. But globally, worldwide, there's at least 3 main concepts that are used. Not the first one, but the one that is most used in developed countries is the guaranteed saving concept. Conceptually, in that concept, the ESCO will take all the risk of the project, meaning they will develop, organize the financing sometimes, and then they will basically guarantee a certain level of savings to the client. In the guaranteed saving concept, the client itself finances the project. It can finance it through its own capacity. It can borrow money from a financial institution. It can be through a lease. There could be a lot of different ways to do it. But basically, it's not the ESCO who's taking the financial risk. The reason why that mechanism is used in most developed countries, as far as the ESCO concept, is that the ESCO, as a company, the main benefit of that company is the capacity to develop, implement, and guarantee, a project and guarantee its savings. An ESCO is not a bank. So an ESCO trying to finance so many clients will rapidly lose capacity to implement such project because it will not have the financial need. So if you look even at the big companies today, the big ESCOs being, as an example, Johnson Controls, Siemens, Honeywell, Schneider Electric, the huge companies very often do not finance the project by themselves, even though they have a lot of financial capacity. It most of the time use the guaranteed saving concept. The second one is the shared saving concept. That one is probably the one that in most new countries, that's what they understand about ESCO projects. This isn't the case where the ESCO does exactly the same thing as in the guaranteed saving project, meaning that they design, they implement, and they follow up on the project. But in that case, the ESCO takes the financial risk. So he gets the financing from a financial institution, implement the projects within a client facility, and he's basically going to get paid back out of the actual savings generated or a part of that savings. So the shared savings, even though there's the word shared in it, means essentially that the financing is done through the ESCO, and the payment of the ESCO is done through the actual savings. As in the case of the guaranteed saving, the ESCO is paid up front as a contractor, and you would basically reimburse the difference of the savings that will not have been generated to the client, so he's able to reimburse the bank on a regular basis. The main problem with the shared saving concept is that the ESCO has to play the role of the bank, meaning that if the client defaults on its payment, it's basically the ESCO who will have to manage that risk, because then he will have to make its payment to the bank whatsoever. It looks a lot more attractive to a client because he has the impression that he's not financing anything. It looks like the project is kind of free. On the other end, there's a downside to it. In a shared saving concept, there's often no guarantee about the savings. So in a guaranteed savings, if the ESCO guarantees that there's going to be €1 million savings per year, then if the €1 million is not there, the ESCO will basically have to pay the difference. In a shared saving model, you basically are not guaranteed of a level of savings. So even if the project was expected to generate $1 million, if it just generated 500,000, then the client will not be able to benefit of a return. On the shared saving as well, there might be an actual share of the savings, meaning that, as an example, 20% of the savings generated on a monthly basis can go to the client, and 80% can go to the ESCO. You would have some other models where 100% of the savings goes to the ESCO, even though we call it shared savings. The rationale for that is the more money kept by the client, the longer the payback will be, the longer the ESCO will have to stay in place to manage the project. So at the end of the day, for the same project, a project where all the savings would be paid directly to the ESCO will have a lower payback time than the one where there's a share. And as we have to understand that the ESCO is financing the project, so there's interest involved in this, it means that at the end of the day, it will cost more to the client to implement the project if he shares the savings than if he gives everything back to the ESCO. So it looks attractive when you need short-term positive cash flow to use that approach, but it's like getting a loan at some point. And most clients don't understand that. What I've seen in a lot of developing countries, and when I mean developing countries, I mean countries where the ESCO concept is developing, is that the shared saving concept is often understood as sharing the benefits on a 50-50 basis. The client believes that he's making a very good deal because he's going to generate savings upfront the first year. So that way, he feels that the project is more beneficial. But actually, in such an approach, it limits quite a lot the type of projects that can be implemented because it may not be viable under a certain amount of time for the ESCO. And the second point is that the cost of the project at the end of the year is going to be a lot more. The third issue with this is basically that ESCOs at some point will have a difficult time to obtain the financing from banks because the banks will see the asset of the ESCO, meaning the actual receivables from the client, as being risky because they're conditional receivables. So the bank may not recognize that asset and will look for other guarantees within the ESCO, and then pretty rapidly, the ESCO will not be able to use that model anymore. So I saw these cases quite a lot in India and in China, for example, where I work quite a lot, where there was a lot of ESCOs having tremendous potential, very good clients, but no capacity to implement more projects than a certain number, and they could not follow up on their other opportunities until the first project was going to be reimbursed. So losing quite a lot of the potential they had in front of them. The third model is called the chauffage concept. So chauffage is a French word that basically means heating. That concept has been around for a lot more time than the other two. It's been basically used essentially in Europe, where we have district heating companies. So the concept is basically that you take over the energy consumption of a facility, might it be only the heating side, it could be just the cooling, but it could be as well all the consumption, and you basically guarantee to the end user a certain level of reduction of its cost, for example, 5%. And it's usually a reduction on the unit cost, not the global cost. And then the ESCO will basically invest in different measures, so the cost of energy will go down. So for example, it may go down 30%. But then the end user will basically continue to pay that amount of energy through the ESCO, but at a lower cost, for 5%. So the difference between the 5% reduction and the 25% actual cost reduction to operate the facility is basically how the ESCO will pay itself. In that case, the ESCO will have to finance itself as well. But it's easier to finance at some point because then the receivables are not conditional. But they're basically conditional only in the sense that if the end user would start to be bankrupt. But otherwise, the end user will have to pay on a regular basis its energy cost through the ESCO, and then the receivable is pretty fixed. So like I said, in Europe, the very typical case of that approach is essentially to apply it to district heating. So you basically use district heating to replace boilers within a facility, and you sell them the energy instead of them producing it directly. That model is not as widely used in many countries, but a company, as an example, that's using it quite well is Dalkia, an international company that you may have in a lot of your countries. It needs a lot more capacities because then you very often overtake the operation of the building. So very often a chauffage contract is associated with operation and maintenance contract. So globally the savings come from the energy, but it comes as well for all the other aspects of operating a building or a facility. So basically, the more a country is developed as far as the use of EPC, the more you will use guaranteed savings. As an example, in Canada and the US, there's two big national programs, the Federal Energy Management Program in the United States and the Federal Building Initiative in Canada, and both are using the guaranteed saving approach one way or the other. In Canada, though, they use the shared saving, but they offer such a guarantee to the ESCO that it's almost like if it was guaranteed saving. So a lot of these projects are financed through the end user. But then we see that the less the country is developed, the more the shared saving is used. Because that's the easiest way to understand an ESCO. They go there and they say, I will do everything and I will finance everything. The downturn to it is very often that these countries, the clients, the end user, are often not very credit-worthy. At least some of them are not. And then you enter the problem that these ESCOs would love to implement those projects, but they cannot do it because the client is not in a position to be secured for financing. So when I say it should actually be the reverse, the more the country is developed as far as its economy, the more likely you will find clients that are creditworthy. So the easier it would be to finance them through an ESCO. And the less the economy in a country is developed, the more difficult it should be to find good clients that are creditworthy. So then you should use more the guaranteed savings. but it's not the case. So in most countries where we start working, when we go there, sometimes we have the statement of end users or people who want ESCOs to come into the country. Oh, finally there's going to be ESCOs because ESCOs will be able to finance projects that no one else wants to finance, which is not a good statement because, again, ESCOs are not banks. And secondly, they're not banks that take very risky projects on the financial side. And ESCO is essentially there to take the technical challenge of a project. The financial part, he has to be sure the client has to be able to repay the savings, even though the savings are going to be there. But if the clients become bankrupt after a while, or what I see in very different countries, that the government itself is not a very secure client, pay back invoices, then we get into a very, very big problem. So EPC around the world, basically, we have a lot more knowledge now of that concept than it used to be. EPC started basically about 30, 35 years ago, essentially in the UK, in the US, and in Canada. My own company, when I started to work there, started EPC projects in Canada in 1980. But nowadays, we can count about 60 countries where there's some level of activities of EPC. Very different from one to the other. Very small in some countries to bigger in some others. But there's a huge momentum to use EPC as one of the ways to unlock potential of energy efficiency. It has to be understood that in a lot of the countries where the EPC is working very well, there was a lot of involvement in the public sector, mainly saying that the public sector used its own facilities to basically launch tenders to obtain such projects, creating a demand for ESCOs. Very often, the problem is that there are ESCOs in countries, they're willing to implement projects, but the difficulty to develop opportunities is very, very long. So as an example, at the end of the 1990s, we started up an ESCO operation in Tunisia, basically launching that concept in that country. And we really started to have some momentum only by 2002, 2003. Before that, we had to present the concept, explain it to people, make the stakeholders understand its value, and it was a lot difficult to be able to convince people to enter in such an agreement when there was none in the country. There's unfortunately not a lot of good information on the market size available. We can look at energy efficiency data as far as some kind of potential, but the EPC cannot be used for each project. For example, it's very difficult to use it in the residential sector because the projects are too small and the transaction costs cannot be covered through such a project. We have to eliminate as well all the clients that could benefit from such a project, but they're not credit-worthy enough to use it. And then, in many countries, there are still barriers related to the public sector that cannot use the EPC under their regulations. For example, when we started to work in Poland, there was a law that municipalities could not enter into a contract for more than 3 years with a private sector company. And obviously, the EPC project that could have been interesting would probably have been 5, 10 years, payback, and so it was difficult. Sometimes it's because the public sector cannot undertake a project when there's a financial involvement in it, so they have to get their loans from banks and they cannot be financed by service providers. I have another case in Brazil where there's a law that prevents the use of EPC in the public sector for a very different reason, but one of which is there's a law that basically says that you have to only enter into a contract with the private sector under the least cost approach. And obviously an EPC, it cannot be based like that because the best project is not the cheapest one. it's often the one that involves the most investment because you generate the most savings. And you cannot win such a project under Brazilian law because they would not be able to evaluate the project otherwise than to look only at the cost. But it's very interesting to see that it's increasing all over the world. We see a lot of potential in Asia. In Latin America, a lot of countries are starting to look for the concept. In Europe, even in Western Europe, it's not as developed in many countries, but we see a lot of movement in most countries. Central Eastern Europe, they've been quite involved with different projects to start to develop that concept. So now we see that most countries in the European Union have some kind of activities like that, but very, very different from one country to the other. And we have even Africa, where we see in northern part of Africa that there's some activities now. And we see in sub-Saharan Africa interest of the concept growing. A lot of demonstration projects being done. Ourselves, we implemented one in Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, to start up a very small ESCOs and to support them for many years to grow. So a lot more activities now than have ever been in the past. Basically, North America is still the biggest market. The main reason for that is the involvement of government widely. So a couple of $1 billion, probably $3 or $4 billion worth of the market in North America altogether, Canada and the US. And EPC is basically, can be done in very different forms. So like I said, it's a concept that when we go back to the original definition, can be applied in very different ways. And the more there is to the development of the concept worldwide, the more we see different types of approaches, blending guaranteed savings and shared savings, and having a lot of different actors in the market. So meaning there's the ESCOs themselves, but very often you will have equipment provider, service providers. We have banks who want to get in that business. So it comes from a lot of different angles. Because they see EPC, first of all, as a very good business, but they see also a good way to unlock a market that they've been trying to develop over time, but have not been able to because of the different barriers we've talked about. Measurement and verification. We cannot have a discussion about EPC without talking about measurement and verification of services or savings. That slide, probably most of you have seen it one way or the other. The concept of energy saving is an interesting one because the asset we're developing is basically absence of consumption. So when an electric company generates electricity, the asset they're generating, the good that they are developing, something that can be measured. You buy electricity, you measure electricity, you pay based on measurement. But with energy efficiency, it's something that does not exist. So that slide basically explains what are savings. On the left side, you see the consumption that used to be there before. And you see on the right side, the new consumption in the dark dots that basically are lower than what it used to be. And if you compare that to what should have been, which is the red dots, basically you see the savings being there. But unfortunately, we cannot measure savings because savings are the absence of consumption. So what we have to do is basically to measure what could be measured, which is the dark dots, the actual consumption of energy, and basically develop a baseline, what should have been, and adjust that baseline to the variation of consumption that should have happened because of change of operation in the facilities, and then verify the savings that are essentially the difference between the red dots and the dark dots. So this is the concept of a baseline, and measurement and verification is basically defined as a way to apply that concept. It's an easy concept to understand. It's not always an easy concept to apply. And one of the reference that you can have to basically understand better M&V is the International Performance Measurement and Verification Protocol that you can download from the website of an organization that's called Efficiency Evaluation Organization. So it's evo.world.org. It's downloadable for free. You have it in 10 languages, I think, and more coming up. It's about an 80-pager document that would explain to you how, or the best practices of measurement and verification. M&V is at the heart of EPC. So it's a very important issue. And at some point, we could have a presentation just on M&V for a couple of hours, help those who would be interested in that concept to basically understand the basics of how it's applicable. But as an ESCO sells savings, he has to be in a position to basically measure those savings, either to be billable to the client under a shared saving project, or either to demonstrate that the savings are there under the guaranteed saving project. One of the biggest failures that I've seen over the time when there's a problem in ESCO project is that people did not agree before the project is implemented on how the savings are going to be measured. And then there's problem because the facility changed, increased level of production, lower operation of the building, and then people say the savings are not there, or if they're there, that's not because of the project, and then we have a legal recourse and somehow, and then project does not go well. So it's fundamental to be able to measure those, to agree on how to measure those savings prior to the implementation of the project. So let me go pretty rapidly to the different models of ESCOs, meaning that in each country, you would have different type of organizations that might be interested in using that concept. What we have quite a lot is a utility-based ESCO. So with the deregulation of the energy sector, a lot of the utilities are seeing their potential market to be reduced based on the competition that will come into their regulated market. So as a way to offer an added value to their clients, to keep the relationship going with them, and very often with the idea to keep those clients on a longer basis, you have utility who are developing ESCOs as a way to promote energy efficiency and at the same time to be able to generate good revenues. Recently, two cases we had was in Croatia and Uruguay, where we supported utilities, World Bank projects to be created in their country, operate. So in those two countries, those ESCOs are working very well. They've been there for at least 5 years, and in the side of Croatia, probably a little bit more. And they implemented over 50 projects each, probably Croatia more than 40 a year, I guess, in the last few years. Another model would be a government-based ESCO. We have two examples of that. We have one in Belgium and we have one in India. The one in India is just started. The rationale for the one in India is basically to be able to offer the needed financing that a lot of the local ESCOs have a difficulty with. So to having the government behind an ESCO to basically be able to implement those projects on a shared saving approach. But that ESCO is just starting up, so there's no good results about it yet. As in the case of Belgium, we had the case of Belesco, and basically that ESCO was there to help the government structure projects and launch tenders, eliminating the procurement risk of the different ministries and federal facilities use the EPC concept. So they created an organization, and then that organization basically took a contract with the different ministries to implement those projects under an EPC approach. And then we have obviously the private sector type of ESCOs. The case of China is a very good one. You have over 300 ESCOs right now that I think are registered in that country. And when we say private sector, they come from all sources. So again, it might be engineering group, it might be construction company, it might be equipment providers that are all interested in promoting their services and their equipment. And they see the EPC as a good way to eliminate the barriers. The ESCO is very popular in China right now because there's a national policy to reduce energy consumption of 20% at the national level. And as so many clients face the barriers we just mentioned before, then the ESCO or the EPC approach seems to be a very interesting concept to address those opportunities. It's just as an example for utility-based ESCO, it's owned by utilities, sometimes directly within the utility, or sometimes as a subsidiary. That they can target any kind of facilities, but an asset of a national utility is very often to be able to sign a contract directly with a public sector facility without having to go through a tender process. As an example, here in Canada, when Econolair, the company I work with, started as an ESCO, we were owned by the national utility. And when we went to hospitals and schools, there was no need to say that they would need to go through public procurement because we were a national organization, so public organization. So we were able to sign the contracts directly. So making a lot easier the signing of those contracts and addressing something that sometime might have been able to address otherwise. As well, when you have utility-based ESCO, very often the project might be of a longer period. So I see a lot in China and India projects that might be from 1 to 3 years payback. But when you have a public utility or even a utility altogether, they're usually very big companies, and they may provide more comprehensive projects with longer periods. So we see like 5 to 8 years, for example. The size of the project may vary quite a lot. It's pretty rare that we see EPC project of less than 100,000 US dollars. There's no upper limit. So we see Croatia, they had maybe like in the 2 million. We see in other countries that it might be bigger. But in Europe right now and in the US, we see contract being signed at $20 and $30 million investment because the type of project it would implement would be addressing municipalities, very big military bases. So the size might be quite higher. The financing they got in those two cases came from the World Bank through a credit line offered to a local bank, and they accepted to finance through the World Bank project these ESCOs. In other countries, we work with private sector banks, but as the guarantees are more difficult to obtain from the ESCO, there's more work to be done. There's a huge advantage for the utility ESCOs, because obviously they have a direct relationship with the client. They already have databases that can be used. It's often easier for them to get the financing. They usually have a pretty good name and recognition from the client, so it's easy to see them and to propose them something. And obviously they have a very good access to government. So if there's something needed to be changed in a regulation, well, they have some more power to try to change those. Well, sometimes on the disadvantages side, they're not as flexible because they have these rules from their utility and they're part of a big system. Sometimes we have difficulty to stimulate staff because they have to be picked up from the utility themselves and they have to be remunerated accordingly. In some countries that may create problems as the best resources to be involved in an ESCO cannot be tapped on because they would not have the financial structure to compensate their remuneration. Government-based ESCOs are interesting as well, especially in a country where you have to start up that concept. So it's kind of a way to jumpstart the approach. So for example, the case of India, the ESL is basically developed by the government to facilitate the implementation of energy efficiency projects. And it may target specific measures that would be beneficial from the country or for different reasons. For example, in India, the agricultural sector is facing a very difficult time related to their relationship with utilities, and reducing their energy consumption might solve some of the problem related to the utility having to provide them electricity without getting paid all the time. So they may use the ESCO as a mean to address some dysfunctional activities or aspects within their countries. For example, if they implement municipal projects, it can heat the financial structure within a municipality, so their cost might be lower. They can use it as well as for climate change purposes, so implementing ESCO projects to generate CDM credits, or basically to help stimulate the economy as well, because then you will have access to financing because it's government, and they stimulate the market that was not well developed in the past. Some advantages for government-based ESCOs. Well, it facilitates the preparation of energy efficiency projects for sure. They can partner with private ESCOs to basically help them address their own barriers and stimulate the market. They have usually a good access to financing, and they can help jumpstart the ESCO market. Well, the disadvantage sometimes is because they have rigid procedures now they have to work, and sometimes it may add some kind of a heavy structure in the project development process. So maybe it's not as flexible as the private sector. Like I said, on the private sector side, that's what you will find in most countries. People see that as a great opportunity to increase their revenue. Very often, you would have an ESCO started by a company that has an interest in some kind of interest in that ESCO. Like I said, consulting firm, construction firm, equipment firm, banks, but there's always some kind of a relationship. It's pretty rare that someone starts an ESCO out of nothing, where they have only the ESCO revenue as their only focus of revenue. So you have all type of ESCO created. They will target specific sectors. Sometimes it will be industries because they have such projects or some equipment. Sometimes it will be only commercial because that's their client base. The payback period might be a little bit shorter, especially in developing countries where the EPC is starting, because they want to cut down on their risk, or often because they see opportunities that can have a very, very good return on investment, and they basically just focus on the few measures that are of a lot of interest. I said 300 ESCOs by 290, now I see 900. It's that a lot of the organizations registered at ESCO are not really ESCOs. They are people who are willing to work with ESCOs. So an equipment manufacturer who's not an ESCO itself, but register as an ESCO to be able to be involved in that market and basically link with different ESCOs, because they can see they can sell services of equipment. Advantage, well, the private sector is always very, very flexible as far as its relation with clients. They focus pretty rapidly on a win-win approach. And sometimes they can focus only on a very specific aspect of the project, so only on one specific technology, on system renovation. The disadvantage very often is that it's required a lot of financial capacity. They have often limited access to government facilities, so you have to go through a formal request for proposal approach. And if it's not there, then there's nothing that can be done about the public sector. We see that in a lot of countries where the ESCO activities are only private sector based. But as I told you previously, most of the countries where there's a very big EPC market is where you have a big involvement in the government as far as having its own facilities being offered in the market to implement such projects. Let's talk about public procurement a little bit. Again, the public sector is likely the group that has the most capacity to jumpstart a market in a country. So in a lot of countries where we worked at developing the legal framework and the structure to help the government use EPC as one of the mechanisms to implement those projects. But then we face very often the problem of procurement. Because the procurement system in each country is not adapted to such a different approach as EPC. Because again, through an EPC, you're selling savings. You're not selling an equipment. You're not selling a specific service. And the best project to be implemented for a facility is most of the time not the one where you invest the least, which has been the typical approach of government procurement goods and services. So solutions must be country specific as far as public procurement, because you have to adjust the legal framework of each country. I would refer you to this book that I had the chance to work with the World Bank, presenting the different ways public procurement has been addressed in different countries and presenting the best practices on how to structure such procurement. It's a lengthy process. It's not something that it's easy to go through, and it takes a long time. But it's very often one of the key approach to launch project on a country, because the government has a lot of facilities, very often not that efficient on the energy side, and most of the time, a lot of these facilities can be financed easier because the fact that they have access to financing sources through development banks or through directly their own budget. In conclusion, basically, EPC is a solution for energy efficiency. Well, I think one of the mistakes in the past has been to see EPC as the solution for all problems related to energy efficiency. It's private sector oriented. It seems that financing is not an issue. And it seems that technically an ESCO can work on projects that are very secure and not challenging. Well, I think it's true that EPC is a very good approach to address all these barriers. On the other hand, it's not the solution for everything. It has limitations. One of the limitations is definitely the size of the project. Developing an ESCO project and going through all the phases needed costs a lot. So as far as the transaction cost, it's definitely more expensive than to go through the standard approach where you design a project, you buy equipment, and you install them. Like I said, we have been involved in projects in some countries where we were able to develop some kind of EPC approach for a project of $25,000. But most of the time, you would see EPC project as being $500,000 to multi-million-dollar project to help ESCO cover all the transaction costs and make the project interesting for them. There's also a limitation about the credit risk of the client. And that's kind of unfortunate because very often the clients that could benefit the most from energy efficiency are the ones that invested the least in these projects. And they invested the least often because they don't have any financial capacity. but we cannot implement such a project in companies that are not financially viable, and even in governments that don't have the financial capacity to repay their service providers. So as soon as there's a credit risk in a facility, EPC is very difficult to implement. As far as the focus market, we can say that the residential is very, very rare in this address. Industrial sector is growing. There's always an issue about the industrial sector because often these organizations would be reluctant to work with an ESCO because they may fear that an ESCO, without the good knowledge of their own process, may mess up with it a little bit. And for them, energy cost is often just a tiny part of their global cost. So risking their actual production level to potentially gain 10 to 20% of energy reduction, which may translate into 1 or 2% of global cost reduction, may be something that you don't feel confident enough to work with an ESCO that is not seen as being specialized in their own process. And I have not seen in the past a lot of ESCOs very specialized in industries or industrial sectors. So it's a growing market. There's a huge amount of potential there, but the concept might be limited just by fear of ESCOs not being up to the task to implement such projects. But there's countries like South Korea where ESCOs are the main market. Industries are the main markets. But if you look at North America and Europe, it would be mainly buildings. And furthermore, the public sector, the building facilities, is often the one that is outstanding because of its size, because of the possibility to install multi-million dollars. And as of today, because of the financial crisis, government may be interested to look at their own framework to enable the private sector to invest into their public facilities to reduce their operation costs. Actually, we just completed a review of all that for the International Energy Agency for public-private partnerships to implement energy efficiency projects. So that's also a document that can downloaded into the International Energy Agency website for free, and it's called the Public-Private Sector Pathway for Energy Efficiency. A lot of successes that has been seen within the market in the last 30 years. Canada, the US, China, Croatia, Germany have all been quite good successes related to the use of the EPC concept at different levels. Croatia, being a small country, is obviously a smaller size. Germany, a way bigger size. But what they claim to be like 1,000 ESCO operated. I doubt that it is such a high number, but there's a lot of activities in Germany about that. Canada being an interesting country as well, where there's a lot of documentation about the 30 years of experience. China is fast growing with very different innovative mechanisms to try the EPC as a mechanism. On the other end, we have some kind of failures. Egypt has been tried quite a lot for many years without having almost any contract implemented. Tunisia is starting, but there has been for like 10 years the introduction of the concept with very, very little real activity. And Poland has been a huge target for many IFIs for many years because of the size of the countries and the potential, but it's just basically waking up now because there has been a lot of issues about the public sector framework and the difficulty to implement those projects through different mechanisms we put in place. Some other countries, we have mixed successes. Brazil and India are two very well documented countries, basically because there was a big World Bank project a few years ago that I had the chance to be part of that was called the three-country project, so China, Brazil, and India. And a lot of work has been done a lot of work has been done to try to eliminate those barriers. In Brazil and India, there are ESCOs operating. Public sector is very difficult to address. So there's been some in India, almost none in Brazil. Utilities are a lot more involved in Brazil than India. When I see mixed successes, the potential is so huge that even though there's a lot of good things being done, it's a very, very tiny part of that market for EPC that's been addressed so far. Basically, that covers the basic, and I thought I was told to look at about an hour and 15 minutes the presentation, so I think I've done a pretty good job because we're sharp at 10:15 my time. So I think I will welcome any question on the presentation.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much, Pierre, for this comprehensive presentation. We already have some questions, so let me maybe go through them. So first question coming from Kurt. Question is, how common are ESCOs that do not deliver energy savings but sell media, such as heat, steam, hot water, compressed air, cooling water, or a fixed agreed price and operates, maintains the boiler, chiller, compressed air station, cogen plant, and the pipe work until the billing meters? For example, steam meters, heat meters, flow meters, at the delivery point of the media to the clients.
Okay.
Well, I don't know whether the question is clear, Pierre. I'll let you read again, probably. And
Okay, well, I think that's a very good question, and it basically refers to the chauffage approach. It's pretty well used in Europe because they're focusing on a lot of heating. I've not seen it used as widely in many other countries because very often that would involve operation and maintenance as well. And like I said, in many of those countries, it's the public sector that is the biggest buyer of EPC projects. And as you can understand, there's a difficulty to involve operation and maintenance in these facilities because you don't have the possibility to transfer the employees from the public sector to the private sector, so it's more limited. But like I said, in Europe, it's been quite a lot used because of the already existing district heating systems. So people would use it either to connect facilities to improve district heating systems or to do the reverse, basically drop the district heating system and to implement some kind of a project under a chauffage project within the facility to increase the efficiency of equipment. Like I said, without being wanted to make any publicity for any firm, Dalkia is probably the firm that has used most of that model worldwide, and it's pretty present in many, many countries. So sometimes now we basically would basically be some kind of known as a Dalkia approach at some point because they really promote it and that's the only approach they use. It's getting more common in the sense that there's more projects like that, but it still represents a tiny fraction of the total EPC market.
okay, thank you. So we have another question from Mayur. Can you give ESCO volumes in US dollars for various markets?
In the US, we're talking, well, it's always difficult to know exactly a volume because as you know, these projects, when they're not done with the government sector, are between private firms. And ESCOs are not that keen to let us know how much a contract is worth. And the client, sometimes we don't even know the client. But the figures that we have right now is the market in the U.S. would be something like $3 to $4 billion a year in the U.S. In Canada, it would be something between $300 to $600 billion altogether. And a big part of those markets are related to the public sector facilities that we know. So the rest is basically an estimation.
Okay, excellent. Next question by Sandra. Could you please comment on the environment for ESC in Indonesia and the current status?
Good question. Obviously, I don't know exactly all the countries. To the best of my knowledge in Indonesia, it has been quite limited so far. Well, energy efficiency is probably starting up to be developed. We have currently a project in Indonesia ourselves with a local bank, with the Asian Development Bank, to finance energy efficiency project. But so far, it's targeting direct financing to industries and not through ESCOs. So there's some ESCOs. I would say that they're basically at the developing stage. And we could not qualify Indonesia as being a developed market for ESCOs from it. The potential is definitely there, but it's definitely a market to be developed.
A question from Ajit. How are adjustments in the baseline made? For instance, changes in the product mix, process efficiency improvements by the client. So everything that relates not to the ESCO but to other factors. Are you still there, Pierre? I think we lost connection. So let's maybe give a few moments for Pierre to connect again to the session. So 1 moment, please. So in the meanwhile, you can check the presentation and recording. So this will be available on our website. So here on the right column you have the relevant links. As well, we invite you to connect to our LinkedIn group. So you could have the opportunity to further interact with other participants to the session today. Let me a few more. Speaker can reconnect again. Okay, so 1 moment, please. We are trying to reestablish the connection with our speaker today.
Yeah, sorry, hello? I lost the I'm there. I'm sorry, I lost the connection.
Yeah. So we were waiting for you to come back. So we were reading a question from Ajit Advani. How are adjustments to the baseline made? For instance, changes in the product mix or process efficiency improvements by the client?
That's a very, very good question that it's difficult to answer in 1 minute. But basically, baselines have to be readjusted based on a lot of different factors. The easiest one in buildings would be weather. But as soon as you get into the industries, then obviously, like you said, the product mix plays a role. Well, there's a way to limit the actual measurement and verification to a very limited period of time when there's a lot of variations within the facility. So I'll give you an example. Assuming that you're working with a motor and you will have an efficient motor replacing an old motor. You may measure the savings through a very limited period of time, let's say a day, and you measure the actual benefit of the motor actually being 95% efficient instead of 80, and then you measure that 15% gain. You don't have to basically measure the motor for 7 years to make sure the savings are there. You basically just measure the efficiency of the motor before and after, and you make sure that efficiency stays there. How much the motor is going to be used, because it may happen that because of different products that are going to be produced, it's going to be more or less used. You just pre-agree on a baseline to say the motor is going to work 15 hours a day. And the variation, if it's going to be used 20 or it's going to be used 10, would be the risk of the end user, the client, and not the ESCO. Because that's something that, through that question I can mention, an ESCO cannot take all the risk of a project. It will take the technical risk of a project, but it cannot take the operational risk of a facility. So that's why public sector facilities have been more popular, because you know that an hospital will probably work for, again, many, many years, 24 hours a day. As an industry, many things may happen, and the actual level of production will vary over time. So that risk of variation of use in equipment is not a risk an ESCO can take easily, because it's not in the business of shoemaking or steel making or whatever. So there's ways within measurement and verification to go around very big variation of baseline. And one of the ways to do it, even though there are others, are basically to limit the time period of the measurement and verification. So you limit the risk of these big variations, so you limit the risk of the ESCO. And the client keeps its own operational risk, which is operating more or less its facility.
Okay, good. Next question by Kurt. Are there any EPCs known which benefit also from certificates of CO2 reductions?
Not that many, unfortunately. The main reason why is that each project is often too small to be able to benefit from a project by itself. I'll give you an example. We had in India, we had an ESCO implement project, a street lighting project in municipalities. And as you can guess, in India, municipalities are pretty big. So each individual project was rather of a good size, like a couple $1 million. The problem is the benefit as far as CERs or any kind of carbon emission reduction was too small to cover a transaction cost. So either if you wanted to go to the real CERs, the process to get it done would have been too complicated for one project. And if you go to the one that are not paying as much, well, the benefit to go to that process would basically impact the project for such a small amount that it was not worth it. So what they actually done, or what we've done with them, is we basically bundle like 15 municipalities together to basically be able to go back to the World Bank, which was the buyer, and sell them a bundled project. And I can only mention the statement of the World Bank team leader who basically worked on that project. He said that's the most wonderful project that I've ever done as far as CERs, because it involved energy efficiency in different cities. So it was wonderful, but it's a project I would never do again, essentially because it was so complicated. Because then you had 15 different municipalities, so 15 different mayors for 15 different organizations to deal with, not at the same speed, and trying to bundle them into one global agreement to basically sell the CERs. So at the end of that, basically we can say that ESCOs has not been very good at using carbon financing, and it's essentially because of the size of the individual project and the complexity to bundle those. But technically, as you know, energy efficiency, it's only eligible for these credits, but it's not been, unfortunately, the main use of the credit has been for energy efficiency because exactly of that problem, the size of the project and the complexity of the transaction.
Okay, next question from Mukesh. What are the dynamics of energy and use technology shifts in the household sector using ESCOs as attractive business model? Do you see any possibility of ESCO working with the residential sector in near future?
Well, that's something that it's looked at. because it addresses a lot of the barriers that you find in the household sector. So the same barriers we've talked at the beginning are present in the residential sector. Now, if we talk about individual households, it becomes very, very complicated because of the size again. Trying to implement projects at a couple of $100 worth through performance contracting, just the cost of measurement and verification and the difficulty to have a homeowner sign a contract like that might be difficult. But then what people are trying to do is simplify it up to the point where there's some kind of performance-based relation within the improvement of a household. So it's kind of related to EPC, but it's very, very limited. So you never have a measurement and verification for 3 years. You would not have a lot of other services involved, like training and awareness and all that. So you try to cut it to its most minimum. Is it possible? Likely so in multi-residential, because the project size becomes a little bit less of an issue. And what people are trying to do is basically to bundle these projects, because obviously, again, the number of these residential activities bundle makes it quite a big project. It's basically discussed. People are trying to find solutions, but the barrier of the size is still there. And today, it's not, we cannot see EPCs involved in the household market, even though you may find one or two small examples. One place that we've tried to implement it through activities we had was Central and Eastern Europe, but then when you go into the multiple households or the collective residential, then you have ownership issues about common spaces and all that. So there's still a lot of work to be done there. Is it possible? Likely. But it will be definitely quite different than what we have seen in the past. And that's one of the beauty of EPC. It's a very, very, very flexible model. It can be adapted almost as much as you want. But as soon as it drops the aspect of the ESCO being paid out of the performance of the project, then you start up about other schemes that cannot be really defined as being EPC.
Okay, next question by Mayur. What's the appropriate ESCO contract model if energy cost is highly subsidized?
It's not really a model that would apply if it's subsidized, because the three models that we talked about, the shared saving, the guaranteed savings, and the chauffage, should apply even though the energy cost is lower because it has been subsidized. It's definitely a huge barrier. But even then, I would say that in most countries that I've been to, there's always possibilities to implement good energy efficiency projects. The cost of energy being too low is definitely preventing some of the measures to be implemented, but you can most of the time find something to be done. It's a barrier for EPC because the benefits are lower, but I think each model could work anyway. It's basically more related to, is there a good project and a financially sound project than actually if the costs are subsidized. But subsidizing the energy cost is not only an EPC issue, it's mainly an energy efficiency project. But I can say something as well as a complementary information there. I saw a country where energy costs were very, very high, and still energy efficiency not being very popular. So it's been my experience that the cost of energy is not always a trigger to more energy efficiency. I would say the biggest trigger related to cost is the changes in cost. So meaning if you have an increase of 25% in the energy cost, it stimulates people to address the issue. But even if the cost is very low or very high, people get accustomed to that cost, and then they see energy as any other tax or whatever that cannot be dealt with, so they just pay the bill. So it's kind of a surprising statement at some point, but it's sure that a reduced cost of energy is limiting the energy efficiency potential and therefore limiting the EPC potential.
Okay, very well. I will just introduce a question that I have. You mentioned that ESCO is not a bank, and its role is facing the technical challenge of implementing energy savings. However, as far as well, I know in Spain, in most of cases, customers have a limited financial capacity, and they prefer to reserve their this financial capacity to core business investments. So in such cases, ESCOs have to face the investment, which means that at the end, only big companies are doing ESCO activities, and they basically focus on big projects. So the question is how a company with knowledge and expertise, but not with big money, can effectively become an ESCO and carry out projects. So should we need a public support agency, as you presented in the government ESCOs, or how could this be done? Thank you.
This is a very, very good question. And I think I'll divide my answer in two. The first is the fact that you're totally right, that one of the barriers related to energy efficiency has been financing. And it's sometimes because people don't have access to financing at all, which basically prevent any kind of project, would it be EPC related or not. If the client is not credit-worthy, there's nothing that can be done. Because even if the ESCO would be financing, then the risk of not getting paid would be way too high. But often it's because the client do not want to use their financial capacity to implement those projects, and then they look for a shared saving approach. Well, my answer is going to be a little bit technical here, but I think it's worthwhile to take a minute to talk about it. Ecolair, again, my company, used a shared saving project to implement over 1,000 projects in Canada. It was in the 1980s that we used that model. At the time, the accounting rules worldwide, especially the one in Canada, but pretty much worldwide, recognized EPC as an off-balance sheet financing, meaning that even though we were financing the project, our contract was seen as an operational lease, if you want, meaning that there was no impact on the balance sheet of the client because he would only pay if the savings were there, and they were paying as the savings were materialized. So it was not seen as a debt. It was seen as an operational cost, like energy is an operational cost. But after the Enron debacle in the 1990s, the accounting rules basically started to be a lot more stiff. And all these schemes about off-balance sheet financing that was used by Enron quite a lot started to impact, and they restricted quite a lot on an accounting basis the use of such off-balance sheet financing. So it means today that even though the ESCO would use a shared saving contract, it is very likely that the accountant would recognize whatsoever the ESCO contract as a loan, impacting the balance sheet of the client the same way as he was having a loan from a bank. And I've seen a couple of deals fail because the client was expecting a shared saving to be off balance sheet. And when the accountant basically presented the fact that it would not be, then the balance sheet of the client did not enable to sign such a contract because its ratio were not met. So I totally understand the issue, and this technicality about the accounting has been limiting the use of shared saving in many countries because of that. Now, in the second part of your question, which is also very, very interesting, even though the company is not very strong financially, you can become an ESCO by adapting the way you will present the approach to a client. So when we say that in a guaranteed savings, for example, you go there, you implement, you get paid up front, and you guarantee the savings, it's kind of implied that you will guarantee 100% of the savings. But it may happen that you would basically say, I guarantee the savings, and if the savings are not there, you will not pay my fees. Assuming that you're a consulting firm, 90% of the cost of the project might be product related. So you can have a mix where the client buys the equipment itself under your supervision, and your fees only are going to be at risk. So what you're basically trying to finance through a bank is only your receivables. So it reduces quite a lot the burden of your company to get financing to implement the full project where you may not have the capacity to do so. The other way to do it is to have a very, very small turnaround as far as the guarantee. Well, you may say that I'm guaranteeing the savings out of a 5-year payback project, but only for 1 year. So when you reduce it to that point, then you get paid a lot more rapidly, meaning that with your limited financial capacity, you can still implement many projects on a more rapid turnover than if you were going to be there for 5 years. So there's ways to do it even though you're not a big organization. The other thing as well, and this is an obvious one, is you may develop a market in smaller projects so that you can work into the $100,000 to $500,000 or euro project, or even smaller, and define a niche for yourself because that's what you have the capacity to do and to guarantee. So there's a lot of flexibility again, and I work with big companies and small companies to do that. It's really the definition of how you will implement it, how you will structure to do it, based on your technical capacity on one side, but often with your financial capacity as well.
Okay, thank you very much. We have many questions today, so I think the the topic is really interesting. We are definitely running very long webinar. Well, I don't know whether, Pierre, do you have still 5 more minutes, and then we could cover a few more questions. Is that okay for you, Pierre?
Yeah, no problem.
Okay. Okay, so could you talk about the experience in integrating renewable energy measures in the ESCO model?
Yes, for sure. Renewable energy can be part of an energy efficiency project easily. It's been the norm that usually we would see renewable energy project on the demand side as some kind of an energy efficiency measure. For example, installing a solar panel within an industry or a building would reduce the energy cost as well as having a better lighting system. So whatever is on the demand side is totally integrated within an EPC. The problem is more on the demand side where you would have a geothermal plant to produce heat for a building, which is considered renewable. So then you would basically produce energy. And that fits a lot better into a chauffage concept than it fits with the shared saving or the guaranteed saving project where they basically more look at the demand side approach. So it's always possible to mix the two, because even though I presented you the 3 pure models, very often they're combined to address a specific project. So basically, as of today, I've not seen as much renewable energy because the payback of these projects is often longer, even though in some cases, because of subsidies or whatsoever, they are not. But usually they're longer. And EPC projects in many developing countries, again, developing countries where EPC is starting, would look at a very, very short paybacks. The longer EPC has been in a country, the longer the payback you will see. So when you want to have the 1 year, 2 year, 3 years payback, it's a lot more difficult to involve renewables. But in practice, there's nothing that would prevent the use of renewables in an EPC project, either on the demand side or on the supply side.
Okay. Another question by Sandra. Why are chauffage arrangements not common in developing countries?
Good questions. First of all, because, like I said, very often it's associated with heat. So you basically replace a boiler and you have a new boiler. So in developing economies, very often there's not so much heat involved. You could do it with cooling, you might say, but it's not been as common. The second reason is often that the size of these transactions are a little bit higher because you take globally the operation of a building and you outsource it. That's been a model that's been quite common in Europe as far as approaches, exactly because of the chauffage approach where they're used to have the heat brought it into the heat, whatever kind of heat brought to the facility through outsourcing, which has not been the case in many different other countries. Even in Canada, we don't have a lot of that concept, even though we have a lot of heating, but district heating is not here almost at all, with few exceptions. And the third is basically because the model is a little bit more difficult to accept, to outsource all your energy and over operation and maintenance. It's kind of a more sophisticated concept because it refers a lot more to added value services. It's been my experience, again, that the more developed the economy of a country is, the more open they are to added value services. And the least they are, well, reversely, the least they're open to that. So even selling a shared saving concept, which is kind of the most basic approach as far as EPC, and it's easy to understand, is sometimes very difficult to sell because people are skeptical. They don't see the added value of outsourcing something like that. And there's been an habit of doing such contracts in these countries. So it's very difficult for a private sector firm to try to develop a concept when there's no understanding of such a concept being potentially interesting in a country. So we see a lot of the roles of the public sector, the agencies of energy efficiency, the ministries and all that, to basically develop the concept within the country so it can be acceptable before you see the private sector come in and try to develop the concept by itself. So that's probably why one of the reasons why we're facing that situation where that concept, even though being interesting in many cases in any country, is not as developed.
Okay, thank you. A question by Vedran. In the tax point of view, is energy performance delivery of goods or a pure service providing? In some countries, the tax authorities consider such performance as delivery of goods. Is it necessary that ESCO is listed on the national classification of activities? Thank you.
You have very, very good questions. Yeah, tax issues are a big problem in many countries. You're mentioning the issue about different taxes being related to a service or goods, and that's something you have to defend to the tax authority, and it's not obvious for them that an ESCO is a service. You see, an energy service company, so it's really a service, even though it involves the implementation of equipment. So they may not recognize easily that it's acceptable, especially when the goods are taxes at a higher level than a service. The other thing we see as a problem is that in a shared saving project, when you're paid over time, the tax authorities will basically recognize that contract being signed as a sale, an automatic sale year one, and basically a facility of payment over the next few years, meaning that you would have to pay all the income tax day one. And that creates a huge problem on top of, on the cash flow basis that we're talking about for shared saving. And it creates an additional burden of having to pay the taxes up front. So it's a constant fight with the tax authorities because when we get into a new country, or that concept gets into a new country, people are not aware of it. They don't understand how it works. They never seen something like that. It's totally a shift of mind as far as the way the contract is working. And we basically have to have a lot of work. So in China, for example, there's been work for like 2 years to work with the tax authorities to address such an issue. It's a lot easier when you do it through an association because you share the cost. As if you're one ESCO, it's more difficult. But each country is different, and the tax issue has to be looked at very well in each of the countries to see how it impacts EPC and how solutions can be obtained. But as you know, working with government on tax issues is never something that takes a couple of days. It's always a very long process.
Okay, very well. Finally, the last questions from Xavier Lemaire. How long can it take to prepare a contract? For the complex ones, can the audit be funded by EE agencies?
Yes. Difficult answer to give because preparing a contract will depend greatly on the complexity of the legislation in a country. But nowadays, because the EPC is a lot better known, we can start from a basic contract that has been developed in many countries and basically adapt them. So we don't have to start from scratch. On the other end, what is asked very often to us is, well, can you send us a contract that we can use in our own country because we don't have any? I'm very, very, very reluctant to do that because one contract in a country may not be very well adapted with another because of the legal regulations. So I would say that within a couple of months, we can probably develop a good contract, but it would need the support of a local lawyer because it has to be fitting with the national legal framework. And there's a lot of issues that are to be covered in a contract. An EPC contract is not a two-pager. It's more likely a 20 to 40-pager because it has to cover many, many possibilities. And very often people find it too long, but as soon as they try to squeeze it down as far as the number of pages and make it more simple, they find out that they have big holes in it. So I guess within a month to 3 months, you can develop something if we have a very good understanding about the issues in the countries. In a new country where EPC started, the problem is that you don't know all these things and you find them out as soon as you start to implement it. So that's why, based on Xavier's question, yes, very often you have energy efficiency agencies or developing agencies, international agencies in developing markets that will basically finance such development of, they will finance the contracts, but they will finance as well the development of the RFPs for the public sector. They will finance the setting up and the training of financing and the training of banks, because it's a triangle, and maybe that's a good way to end up that discussion. There's 3 aspects into it. You have the ESCOs, you have the clients, and you have the banks. And each of them has to play a role. And if you only concentrate on the creation of an ESCO with a good contract, you'll lack the capacity in the other 2. So you need really the 3 there, and the one that has been the least developed so far in the countries is the client. So you have more and more ESCOs that are knowledgeable there. You start to have some kind of financing capacity in some countries, but very often the awareness and the understanding of EPC by end user is limited. So it creates a lot of frustrations to the ESCOs, because it's difficult to enter a final agreement with the client, so the transaction costs go on and go higher. So yes, contracts are very, very important, and at some point that could merit a 1-hour presentation as well on only contracts.
Okay, excellent. So this is a really wide field. Another question from Xavier. Could international agencies intervene in developing countries to back up ESCOs?
Yes, there's a lot of cases like that. International agencies, would it be IFIs, or would it be bilateral organization, would basically help the support of the development of EPC in countries. Well, they will do it at very different levels. Sometimes they do it at the government level for the legal framework, the contracts. Sometimes they do it at the bank level to help the banks finance such ESCOs and such projects. And sometimes they do it at the creation of ESCOs, the case of Croatia and Uruguay being 2 that we mentioned, where it was the World Bank backing that basically helped create those ESCOs. You also have the ones like EBRD and IFC that works directly at the private level that basically would be investors in such ESCOs in some countries. So there's cases in different countries where there's ESCOs that have been created by these kind of organizations. So yes, definitely in markets where such support is eligible, more and more you see interventions to help promote the EPC concept in these countries.
Okay. I think this is last question. Is an ESCO usually picking only the raisins, less than 1 year payback, or is doing a comprehensive energy audit and implements also measures not that profitable? For instance, more than 10 years payback, for instance, measures on buildings, envelope, insulation.
That's, again, a very good question. You have both, meaning that the least developed the market as far as EPC is, the more people will tend to basically do cherry picking and basically just do the 1 year payback. The reason for that is that very often ESCOs are small, so they need a very rapid turnover. Sometimes they feel that the client is not secure enough, so they don't want to stay there for a long time. And sometimes that's because they just cannot get financing for more than 1 year out of a bank, so they really want to have something very, very rapid turnover. But then on the other side, the more the country is developed, as far as EPC and as far as the economy is developed, very often you would have the 10 years and more. So the tendency in the US, the tendency in Europe, is more to have the 10, the 15, the 20, and even the 30 years. And the reason for that, I'll take the case of France as an example, is where there's a very strict objectives about the reduction of energy consumption and green gas emissions. And they're focusing municipalities, for example. So in order to reduce the municipality cost by 30% and achieve their carbon emission reductions, then they have to go at a lot longer period of time. The second reason as well is very often the municipalities and the public sector will use the EPC as a way to finance the improvement of their facility altogether. Not only in the energy efficiency side, but a improvement of a roof insulation may have a 20-year payback, but the roof has to be replaced whatsoever. So they take the opportunity of an EPC to replace the roof. It's not financially as attractive as others, but they have a new roof. So you have the two. You have the 1 year, you have the 20 years, the 30 years. The tendency in developing countries, shorter, 1, 2, 3 years. The tendency in developed countries, 10 and more.
Okay, excellent. Last question. By Kurt, do you think it would be useful to the verification of the monitor savings to have an independent third party?
Might be. If you look at IPMBP and if you look at the literature, you will say that basically anyone can do the measurement and verification. There's no requirement that a third party does it. And very often in the practice, the ESCO does it. If you have a very, very good plan, the plan is approved by everyone and understood by everyone. Whoever does it does not really matter. But obviously it could be seen that the ESCO is in conflict of interest to measure its own savings because its remuneration is linked to it. So yes, there's been a tendency in Europe, a little bit in North America, to have a third party involved. The only downside to have a third party involved is basically it increases somehow the cost, because whatsoever the ESCO will have to do measurement and verification for its own purposes, because they're in charge of the savings and they cannot let a third party basically do the follow-up for them, the monitoring for them. So it's been a tendency. There are some firms that have been created to basically act as third-party validators. There's a good merit to do that, and sometimes it's a very good approach because it reassures all parties that there will not be any different when doing that. But we have to recognize that it's not been the major part of how it's been done in the past.
Okay, excellent. So thank you very much, Pierre. I think it was the longest session ever, but we had many questions, so that shows the big interest of this topic. So thank you very much. Pierre, thank you very much to the audience to be so patient. You submitted very interesting questions, so I think, well, we have here a pool of professionals interested in this topic or probably involved directly in these questions. Excellent. So thank you, everybody. See you again in a couple of weeks for the last session on this course of regulation and energy for developing countries. And now, Pierre, I let you close the session today.
Thank you very much to all. It's been a great pleasure. And if there's any follow-up on this ESCO issue or part of that, it's going to be my great pleasure to participate again. So thank you very much for having invited me, and hopefully it was of interest for everyone.
Okay. Okay, Pierre. Are you still there?
Yes, I'm there.